In the last lesson, we taught foundation models how to use an API to gather data. And in this lesson, we will teach it another skill, and that is to interact with your iPhone and create reminders for you. The techniques used in this lesson can, of course, be applied to any other function that gets called. Reminders is just the example that I chose for the lesson. So before we get started, you need to head into your info.plist file or just your info tab here in your project settings. And you need to add the privacy reminders full access usage description key with any arbitrary value. So in my case, I let the AI create reminders for you. This is needed as we need to ask for permissions to access reminders. And then I've already created a file called reminder tool. And in here, we'll of course import foundation models in order to have access to the tools protocol or the tool protocol. And we'll also import EventKit, which is used to interact with the reminders. So we'll create a struct and I'll call it reminder tool, and this will conform to the tool protocol. As you know from the last lesson, we'll need to provide a name and a description. So our name will just be reminder tool and our description will be a tool to create a reminder on a given date. Then we'll also provide some arguments. So these will be at generable struct arguments. And in our case, what do we care about for a reminder? We need some sort of title, which is a string. And this is pretty self-explanatory, so we don't really need to add a guide here. And we also need a due date, which will also be a string because dates are not generable. So you'd have to add conformance for that. In our case, we're just going to use a string. And because of that, we will add a guide with a description. And let me quickly type that out because it's a bit more complex. All right, so I just typed out our guide and it basically just describes to foundation models in which format we want to store the date in this string variable here. So now that we have our arguments, we can implement the call function. And unfortunately, we can't return void here. This doesn't work, so we'll have to return something. And in our case, we'll just return a bool as a success indicator. All right, so before we can access reminders or create new reminders, we'll have to get an EK event store. So let's create that. And then we'll have to ask for permissions. So we'll try await store.request full access to reminders. Let's also add a return true here at the end, just so we don't get this warning all the time. All right, so now that we requested access to reminders, we can get started with creating our reminders. So let's say let reminder equals EK reminder, and we'll pass in our event store here, and then we can say reminder.title is our arguments.title, so our argument that foundation model passes to this tool. When working with EventKit, we'll also always have to provide a calendar to reminders and events. So we will say reminder.calendar, and this is our store.default calendar for new reminders. So this is something that you'll just have to set up. It doesn't really do anything except for setting the calendar to the currently used one. And please note that this is an EK calendar and not a calendar from Foundation. So you can't just do calendar.current. You'll have to create the correct EK calendar here. All right, and then we'll add our due date. So let me quickly create a formatter, which is a date formatter. And then let's say formatter.date format. And let's just copy paste our format that we passed to our guide up there. And then we can say if let date equals formatter.date from our arguments.dueDate. And then we've grabbed it here, and EventKit doesn't need a date, it actually needs date components. So let's grab the date components from this date that we just created. So we can say reminder.doDate components, and this is basically calendar.current.date components. And what we care about is the year, the month, and the day. For now, we don't care about the time, but of course you could add that functionality to your app as well. And the data that we passed in is of course the one that we just created. And just like that, we've also set the due date to for our reminder. And then lastly, we'll have to try store.save our new reminder and commit true. And this should basically already be it for a basic implementation. Once we run this on the simulator, you'll see though that this will possibly create an issue. So before we can actually try it out, we'll have to register it in our language model session. So we'll create a reminder tool here, and we'll also do it down here where we reset our session through the little reset button. So let me quickly spin up the simulator and let's test it out. All right, so now that the simulator has loaded, let's try our request here. So today, create a reminder to bring out the trash. And let's see what happens, what reply we get. And it's asking us for the permission. So that's great, because that means that FoundationModels did actually call our reminder tool. So let's allow that. The reminder to bring out the trash has been successfully created for today. So let's switch to the reminders app. And there we go, bring out the trash. But you will notice an issue which is corresponding to the date. So while I'm recording this, it's October 24th, 2025. So this is basically over 2 years in the past. And this used to be a common issue with large language models that didn't have access to tools or functions or searching the internet. And FoundationModels is a very small LLM, or at least the current implementation through language model session in iOS 26 uses a very small local LLM. So working with dates is always an issue, but there are some workarounds that we can do. So if we gave this an exact date, then it would store it in due date and then everything would be fine. So if we said bring out the trash on October 24th, 2025, this would work just fine, but unfortunately it just doesn't know what today refers to. So in order to fix that, there is a simple approach. Of course, this is not guaranteed to work because large language models are always based on statistics. The way it works is it goes through, when it generates the arguments here, so what to call our reminder tool with, it goes through them line by line. So title gets generated first and then due date gets generated. And we'll make use of this, and between title and due date, we'll add another variable and we'll say explicit date mentioned. And this should be a Boolean, and we'll give this a guide. So the guide that we're using is set to false if the user didn't mention an explicit due date or they mentioned today as the due date. So this error case here, set it to true if an explicit date was mentioned. And then down here, let's actually make use of this explicit date mention variable. So we already have an if check here, so we could wrap this either in another if, or we could just chain the commands here, and I prefer to do that. So let's say if arguments.explicit date mentioned, and only if one was mentioned, then we'll extract it with our date formatter. In the other case, let's copy this. Oops. And instead of using our date from our arguments, we'll just say date.now. And this will basically use the correct date as today instead of the outdated one from the model. So let's rerun this on the simulator. So I've had to actually change up this guide here a little bit because the one we used previously didn't make the model actually create date.now. So I've changed it to true if the user explicitly mentioned a due date, false if due date is today or no due date was mentioned. And here you can see the top one is our old reminder that we created before we had this explicit date mentioned variable. And the second one is, of course, our fixed implementation. So, of course, this is just a quick fix and in no way a guarantee that this will always work for all dates. So you could, for example, think about creating a date tool that transforms text into date somehow. But I'm guessing that you're not going to rely on this exact implementation for your app, as this is just an example. Please subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed this lesson.